Hello, and to those of you who are just joining, welcome to the economy stage here at the CogX Hybrid Festival 2021. My name's Felicity Birch, and I'm the Director of Innovation and Digital at the CBI, and I'm delighted to be emceeing the economy stage today. CogX is a global leadership summit and a festival of AI and transformational technology, addressing the question, how do we get the next 10 years right? And this is all the more important as we consider the impact of the pandemic on all of our lives. You'll have heard talk of building back better after the pandemic, but where are we really on the plan to remake our economies? Will we seize the opportunity to create a new and better society? Well, we're going to start our next session in a moment, but do feel free to submit questions throughout the session for the Q&A at the end. Tweet us via @CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 and submit questions throughout the session through Hopin. Already this morning, we've had a fascinating session on the role of the development banks in supporting recovery around the globe. And up next, I'm delighted to announce a session on the post-pandemic economy and society with Mackenzie, the Chief Exec of think tank Demos, and Hetan Shah, CEO of the British Academy. Polly and Hetan will explore what we've learned from the COVID crisis and how it can help us deal with the post-COVID fallout. In this session, they'll go behind the curtain to reveal what's next for our economy and our society, and how we can use the COVID crisis to steer our country in the right direction. So with that, I'll hand over to Polly and Hetan.
Hi there.
Hello.
It's so nice to see you again. I don't think I've seen you in person for several years, but it's great to be talking about the future of the economy. As anyone listening may know, we worked together on a piece of work that we did at Demos on life after COVID, how public opinion has changed around how we ought to be running our society and the economy. But Hetan, you also did a fantastic piece of work at the British Academy, commissioned by government, in which you introduced the idea of the COVID decade, which just feels really relevant today, given what we've just heard from Felicity, what we're discussing today around how do we get the next 10 years right. So it'd be great if you could just tell me a bit more about that concept of the COVID decade and the way in which the economy and our society are going to be shaped by the impact of the pandemic.
Thanks, Polly, and great to see you here and to be at CogX. Yes, so the British Academy, the National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, was approached by Sir Patrick Vallance, who posed a sort of short but very difficult question to us, which is, what's the long-term societal impact of the pandemic? We've all thought of this as a health crisis, but actually it's clearly going to have a huge number of social, cultural and economic effects as well. So we spent the 6 months from sort of September last year to March this year gathering the snapshot of data that was sort of emerging to see what do we know about the pandemic and its long-term effects. And I can't talk you through all of it now, but in short, our research showed that the pandemic had solidified, exacerbated and exposed existing inequalities, as well as showing increasing reliance on local communities and even hyper-local interventions. So, it was your neighbours who were helping you shop when you were down with COVID, for example, and the importance of civil society as well, more generally. So these were some of the themes that came out. And we posed this notion, as you say, of a COVID decade, that even if the vaccine comes in and gets rid of the pandemic in terms of the health impacts, actually the social impacts will be playing out for a very, very long time. Think about, for example, the way that we plan our societies in terms of urban planning. Are we now going to be working from home much more? What are the impacts on transport systems and how we organise city centres and shops and so on? That's just one example. But there were a whole series of policy goals that we developed, really to kind of keep the feet to the fire of policymakers who I think are keen to use the pandemic to what is now, we hear the term build back better. But the policymakers, I think, have got very little bandwidth at the moment with all sorts of things, including just backlogs of public service delivery, etc., etc. So we wanted to paint a longer term vision for them about the society that we could create.
It's a bit scary and gloomy, though, don't you think? When I think about the COVID decade, I sort of want to despair. I mean, the thing that got me really early on was, having worked in government on narrowing the attainment gap between richer kids and poorer kids, basically 10 years of progress was eliminated in 10 weeks. It's kind of heartbreaking. And how do you conquer that sense of despair, and sort of what's the top of your worth worrying about list, right? Like things where you feel like a big intervention, a big change would actually make a difference, to at least eliminate my despair.
Well, I think that it's always the same, that you always feel some level of worry or despair about the state of the world, but you've also got to look for where can we kind of improve things, as it were. And the notion of a COVID decade wasn't just about the shadows, but was about the glimmers as well. There were things that the pandemic helped sort of show, that actually you can change society in a kind of wholesale way quite quickly. And the unity of purpose between policymakers, business and civil society, I think, was really striking. I mean, take the way that we developed the vaccine, which was a kind of mix of university researchers, business coming together and kind of making that happen, but then civil society in particular working with the state to overcome vaccine hesitancy. So I think one of the overarching things we were saying is, let's maintain that sense of social purpose on the issues that we're facing collectively. One of the things that I think is slightly difficult about our report, though, is that we say these are a series of interlinked challenges that we face, and so they require interlinked solutions. So it's not that there's one easy kind of magic bullet that solves things. I mean, on education, as you say, there are a whole series of measures put forward by Sir Kevin Collins, which probably haven't moved forward and may or may not do so. But I think our report was saying it's not just about educational intervention for young people. Think about, local sports clubs, youth clubs, et cetera, all of that has been devastated as well. And how do we intervene in some of those areas, not just in the kind of the usual ways? And the other thing we touched on, I think, which is quite subtle, is governance. That the UK has got this very centralized system, and it didn't work effectively, for example, with track and trace. It was only when we brought local government in that things started to work really well. So how do we build upon the lessons of that to make sure that interventions are designed at a kind of really good local level? I think that's one of the things that came out of the Demos Commission that we both worked on. And your work pointed to where the public is at in terms of some of the changes that they might like to see.
Yeah, it's really striking that you and the amazing academics involved in the British Academy project kind of started with the evidence and the data, and we at Demos started with public opinion and public experience, and we actually ended up with really quite similar overlapping conclusions about what people want and what it is that they need, which in a way feels quite reassuring. Like sometimes I feel quite gloomy about democracy. It feels that we're going through a phase of populism, or just there's so many challenges, and bringing the voters along with that is very difficult. But actually what we discovered is if you give people the time and the space to think about these issues, they're actually really open, including open to big ideas about how you transform society. I think one of the areas it might be worth thinking about is technology, because it's a technology conference, right? But is that intersection between technology and society. People at Demos, we do loads of work about misinformation. We've tracked bot activity and kind of algorithmic decision making, all of that. And so we, classic cognitive bias, just assumed that would be kind of foremost in people's minds when we asked them about their experience of technology during this pandemic, the infodemic. Actually, top of people's minds was, I wish the dratted Wi-Fi would work. And next was a kind of set of societal concerns about kids not being able to access the internet, about making sure people had the devices. I think our conversation moved on of recognizing it's not just about broadband access, it's about devices, it's about skills and training and understanding of how you get people involved. But people broadly are really, really positive about that shift that we saw during the pandemic. The gloomy stuff is 10 years of progress on education eradicated in 10 weeks. But I've heard technology people saying that, 10 years of projected adoption rates for tech happened in 10 weeks. And that's really exciting if you can work out what you do about the people who are left behind. there's so much talk though about technology as if it's the source of all well-being. You obviously run the British Academy, which leads the arts, the humanities side of academic research. Do you ever feel like you're the sort of poor relation, the boring people, the non-fashionable people, because everyone wants to talk about, I don't know, jabs and artificial intelligence?
No, I think the pandemic has actually really shown that you need the kind of STEM side, the science and technology side, but also what we're increasingly calling the shape side, social science, humanities and arts for people in the economy. I mean, the vaccine's the classic example. Science gave us the vaccine, but it's social science and humanities that gave us the insight on vaccine uptake and how you challenge vaccine hesitancy and so on. But I think that's happening across all sorts of spheres. If you think about the grand challenges that we face as a country, be that rebuilding the economy, which is going to require economists and sort of business schools and management to think about net zero, which is not just a technological change, but a behavioral change, which is going to be required. But even kind of deep-seated questions around governance, this goes beyond kind of pandemic issues, but the whole issue of post-Brexit, the rise of English nationalism, whether you have Scotland kind of breakaway or not, these are deeply cultural issues. I mean, that you can't see technology solving them, as it were. So I, in fact, feel quite the opposite, that the British Academy and the disciplines that we, think around and represent are really central to the questions that we face as a nation in the coming decade.
I wonder if you can help me, because my daughter is currently involved in a dispute, she's 9, with her teacher, because he treats art as if it's a treat, not a lesson. And so sometimes art is cancelled if they've been naughty. And she's sort of trying to put together a campaign to persuade him that art is a real subject. So perhaps we need your leverage on that one.
Very happy to help write a letter or whatever is required. But yeah, I mean, think about the notion of the kind of economy we've got. It's an 80% services economy, highly creative. Look at the businesses around the world which kind of make money, Apple and kind of design, et cetera, and even in the sort of pandemic stuff. I mean, the way we design bathrooms or the way that you queue at the supermarket all become really, really important. So actually, art and design isn't this kind of nice add-on. It is about how we kind of design society. It's really important.
I think you're completely right. I mean, it's why we do policy in the way that we do at Demos. I spent, I don't know, too many years really, 15 years working in public policy, and always thinking that the way of doing it is that you somehow get a bunch of clever people together, put a wet towel on your head and just sort of figure it out. Is that it? Is it wet towel? Anyway, you know what I mean. And what I've realized in the last kind of 5 years, having been involved outside of government in policy making, that if you haven't got consent and understanding, if you're not connected to the values and the culture and the identity of people, what you've got is a kind of a theoretical solution. And in sort of policy circles, there's all of things like wouldn't it be nice if we had road user charging? Because from an economist's perspective, that's obviously a better system and a better model. You just ask people to pay. And that's the kind of thing which has been on a shelf in the Treasury for 25, 30 years, because it sort of just doesn't chime with people's experiences and values. The same with, I don't know, bugbear inheritance tax. You always, have these conversations about how it just doesn't make sense. This is unearned income. Why is it that people care about having that taxed and don't care about having income tax in the same way? And yet you're plugging into culture and values and identity. I think it's where policymakers went so wrong, really. So we have to find a way of involving people in decision making. And that, I think, does require so much more devolution, I think. We have this really centralized system. I used to say, I'm going to get myself in trouble potentially, but fortunately I'm not very important. But I used to write speeches for Nick Clegg, and he would always say that we were the most centralized country in Europe, except for Malta. And he'd been saying this time and again. Then he was Deputy Prime Minister, said it again, and we got a letter from the Maltese ambassador saying, stop being rude about Malta, and trying to talk about actually how devolved governance is, even within Malta, and trying to make the case that Malta is in fact, very decentralized in comparison with the UK. Do you think we can make progress on that, though? We've got this big agenda on levelling up, on devolution. will it be delivered, or is it just exactly what 20 years ago John Prescott was talking about? And do you remember David Miliband? He had a trend that he called it double devolution.
Gosh, yeah, I remember a pamphlet on that. But I see little prospect for more devolution, sadly. I mean, even the levelling up agenda doesn't really feel as if it's framed in terms of governance. It's one of the reasons we kind of highlighted that issue in our COVID decade review, because I think it's not getting the prominence there. Levelling up, though, as you and I have discussed on a few occasions, is still currently a slogan rather than a policy, and could be articulated in a quite number of different ways. What is it that you're trying to level up? Is it places, which seems to be how it's framed at the moment? Is it deprived groups, or is it individuals who are most at risk of deprivation, or are most deprived? Because depending on those three different ways of cutting it, you end up with quite different solutions. And I think in your own work at Demos, you've talked about leveling up social capital, not just economic. I don't know if that's something you might want to say a bit more about.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's I've got far too much to say. So the leveling up agenda is really fascinating. We saw in the pandemic the way that cultural and community relationships were absolutely fundamental to the ability of communities to survive and be resilient in the face of these extraordinary challenges. And one of the problems is that we know that there is more of that community interaction in richer areas than there is in poor areas. So one of the things that was really great about the pandemic, so we think about 4 million people made a new friend locally, someone they could call on an emergency, who they didn't have before. But richer people were about 50% more likely to have made a new friend than poorer people. And that's a problem. If not just is there a divide, but in the existence of a crisis, the divide actually widens. But of course, it's nightmare, right? Like, how do you get central government in Westminster and Whitehall to work out how you increase the social capital and community relationships between 100 people on a particular street in Burnley? I mean, obviously, if central government tries to do that, it will utterly fail. So the question is, how do you do something which is so system level, so individual, so personal to that place, and how do you support it from national government? And the reality is you just can't. You've got to devolve the funding and the freedom. And it's why David Miliband came to this double devolution idea, right? You devolve from national to local, you devolve from local to the hyper-local. There's this question which has come in from Claudia Martinez saying, how important will greater trust in government, including local government, be in the post-COVID economy? And I think that trust question is so fundamental, that people can have much stronger trusting relationships between them and their hyper-local community, and then stronger relationship with local government they can with central government. So I'm sitting here in the Demos library. Somewhere behind me is an excellent report about building trust between citizens and their local government. And it's so much easier than building trust with, Westminster and Whitehall's always going to be remote. You don't need to get into I hate London, Westminster's evil, politicians are charlatans kind of narrative to just recognize it's a long way from a lot of people, and it can't be hyperlocal. So I think if you want trust, and in fact, I think you need it to be able to build up our capabilities, you've just got to find a way to devolve. And I sort of, you made me depressed again, with your kind of concern that we can't really get there. Do you think universities?
We're just jumping on trust briefly.
Of course, jumping on trust.
I mean, we looked at trust, and it did exactly really as you were saying. So trust in central government did rise actually just during that kind of first lockdown period, and I think there was a sort of sense of we're all in it together, and and then it dropped. Whereas trust in local government has remained relatively high in comparison, as it were. So I think your point about whom we can trust is really important. But I think one interesting twist on all of this about kind of what can government do to support the kind of the social interactions that are so important. And I think, there's this emerging term, social infrastructure, which no one quite knows what it means, but it sort of means investing in local community things and civil society and so on. I think there is an argument to say, in an ideal world, yes, you would do much more of that at the local level. But if you and I are sort of, or certainly if I am right to be pessimistic that kind of devolution is not going to happen, there are still things that can be done from a central level. So, a government that doesn't just, like the Levelling Up Towns Fund stuff is all about investing in making your high street look a bit prettier. But if some of that was being used for how do you invest in local charities, local community groups, the arts centre, etc., that will get to developing those friendships in a slightly indirect way. Because if you create those spaces where people can meet and get together at the local level, and that's just, I think, going to be more and more important, especially if we do see the sort of digital changes that you alluded to earlier, where if 10 years worth of digital changes have been compressed into 9 or 12 months, and we, many more people are working from home, etc., where you see yourself as kind of living and working and whom you interact with will really shift.
Yeah, we're doing a program of work actually over the rest of this year that's looking at how we can leverage the money we put into our public services to generate more interactions between people. And I think a key part of that is going to be face-to-face services. That doesn't mean we try and stop the shift to technology, because of course digital services can be so much more flexible. They can be often better for the patient and the doctor, or whatever kind of service provider relationship you're talking about. I remember reading an example from don't know if you've ever read it, the David Boyle review of public services, which was commissioned when I was in government, of somebody with arthritis who is expected to travel for an hour and a half on 4 buses in order to see her consultant once a quarter. Actually, you do that by Skype or whatever video conferencing. It's obviously better for her and the consultant. But if you strip out some of the things that can be simplified, you're then left with, what is it that only humans can do? And actually, there's plenty of parts of the relationship, the civil society infrastructure that you can then bring together, whether that is a place you can go on the high street where you can get support to log into some of those virtual services, for example. I often think about the Full Monty, which I do recognize as fiction. But, in the Full Monty, right, the steel workers who've lost their identity as well as their job. And obviously stripping is not necessarily the career solution for everybody. But, there's that moment in the job center where they start to dance. And it's like this iconic reconfiguration of their identity. And nowadays you claim your benefits sitting at home, typing into a laptop. So given that we know people are stripped of identity and relationships and experience and culture when they lose their job, well, how can we reconfigure the job seeking experience so that, yes, you can do loads of the easy stuff online, save money that way, and then reinvest some of that in face-to-face services that may be on a reconceptualized high street, so that people still get the opportunity to be with one another and to challenge that kind of atomization. So we're looking across, public service after public service, identifying ways that you can just kind of shift the needle on those kinds of things.
And despite my pessimism about levelling up as being perhaps a kind of too economic and economically sort of focused agenda as against a socially focused one, it does feel as if the conversation has changed in the sort of direction that you're touching on around the importance of identity and the importance of place rather than a kind of purely technocratic approach to policy making, which I think is kind of what has been pushed back upon. And the Brexit outcome, whatever people think of it, I think has brought back the notion that you've got to take people with you. You've got to have a sense of touching what is going on at kind of the identity level, not necessarily what's happening at economy level. So I think, in a sense, there's fertile discussion going on. We're coming to the end of our time, I think, Polly, but I wonder if we might, I'd value your reflections on, in a sense, what brought both our projects together, which is this question of, are we at a Beverage moment? Looking back at the history, which is something we did with many kind of good historians at the British Academy, there have been moments where you've had past pandemics or other sort of turning points in society where things have changed, and World War II and Beverage is the obvious one. You've had other moments where that hasn't happened. Spanish flu was a good example where really little changed, or cholera in the 19th century where things did change for a bit. Public health boards were sort of brought forward, but then things slipped back because there wasn't the kind of policy or public support. So a few months on from your commission, what's your reflection on the level of change we might now expect to see, that the kind of, both public appetite and policy appetite is looking for?
I think the challenge is that for it to happen, it's not just that Beverage wrote a report and then it magically happened. You had the coalescence of public mood for change that led to the election of a new government that was really committed to a different way of doing things. And I think it's great to see the government, at the beginning of this year, talking about building back better, adopting that kind of phraseology and being ambitious, there's no question. But will it be a step change in the kind of social settlement? I think it's hard to see how you get there, partly because I don't think the shift in public opinion is as dramatic as some commentators have suggested. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were some people sort of saying, well, we can never go back. Everything will be completely different. This proves we need to tackle climate change. And we, in our work, couldn't really identify much of a shift around climate change particularly. There's a kind of a commentator level insight, which is actually we can mobilize to do huge things. And there are people for whom that's been a new realization. But, like with so many experiences, lots of people have simply strengthened their opinion. So we think that about twice as many people, about 50% of people, say they believe what they believed before the pandemic, but more. And it's only about 25% of people who say they've changed their minds, as in flipped their opinions about big issues like how we should run the economy, how we should run society. So it feels to me like, in a way, what we've done is we've taken a series of kind of problematic public policy trends, like our aging population, like the challenge of how you regulate technology, like what we do about leveling up places that have been left behind. And we've made them harder for ourselves. We've got a government that's quite committed to carrying on with that, but it just feels like there's probably more momentum and more challenge behind quite a similar set of problems, rather than a sense that we need to completely change the direction of the country. And in a way, that's, again, a bit depressing for those of us who might have wanted a big change, for example, on climate change. It's still going to be really hard. I think public policy advocates like you, like me, still have a job of work to be done, but maybe that's just self-serving.
Well, I'd agree. And I think there are a series of kind of contradictions. On the one hand, perhaps more interest and appetite for change. I mean, not masses, but, enough kind of thinking, but actually, as you say, financially probably more constrained than we were before. So it makes it harder to make those choices, even if there's a bit more appetite to do it. The other one, I think, is in a sense, a tension between what the ideological drive, if you might put it like that, of this government is, and it switches, doesn't it, from the kind of Rishi Sunak austere Treasury. I mean, put furlough to one side, which I think was the kind of aberration and a very good one, but the Treasury wants to go back to kind of the usual way of working, and Duncan Weldon's book coming out later this year, I think kind of makes this argument. I just read the piece in Prospect that it's all J.S. Mill and Gladstone to blame for the fact that none of this ever gets off the ground, because they're the dead hand of the Treasury sort of stops anything from happening. Whereas the kind of number 10 unit clearly thinking in rather a different way, but I think still trying to find its mojo as to kind of how to implement some of the kind of thoughtful things it's trying to do. So levelling up is has been batting around for a while, but we're still not really very much clear on what that means or how it will happen. So that feels to me to be kind of important tension.
Yeah, it's a cultural split, isn't it, in the Conservative Party as well, around whether they want to make this big pivot to being essentially statist left wing on economics and pursue the kind of the cultural conservatism, or whether they actually want to remain on the liberal economic side, which is the global Britain narrative. So there's clearly really strong advocates and proponents of more traditional conservatism, liberal, free market, low tax, low spend, if we can ever get back there. And another group of people who are just really comfortable with the pivot that lots of people have been saying was somehow needed in politics towards a more socially conservative, economically statist, high spend, high control, probably a bit more skeptical about trade. And I honestly, I don't know where the Conservative Party will end up. Its abiding skill is to adapt to the circumstances and find a way to win no matter what.
Well, Polly, it's a fascinating conversation. Always good to chat to you, and I could do it for hours, although I don't feel the rest of the wider public wants to hear us. So we might take this over a drink next time. But thanks so much for making the time to have a chat. And I think, my reflection is that there are lots of good ideas out there and some movement towards change, but actually it's quite a complex and uncertain picture at the moment, which is a bit unsatisfying and, as you said, a bit depressing. But that's where we are.
Yeah, let's catch up in real life next time.
All right. Great to see you.
Bye.
Well, thank you so much to Polly and Hetan for a fascinating discussion. And I certainly could have listened for longer. I think there was so much to take away, but it does feel like a critical moment for the UK economy, with public mood for change and new political impetus behind levelling up, but a realistic assessment on this session about how hard some of this change is going to be. Two things in particular struck me. Firstly, the importance of considering the interaction between technology and society, especially things like access to connectivity, skills and devices, but also the role of social science, humanity and art alongside technology. And I really liked Hetan's comments about how science gave us the vaccine, but social science is the way to roll it out and to consider tricky issues like vaccine hesitancy. Thinking about levelling up as well, the need for trust in political institutions and the role of devolution and local delivery in supporting some of this. So a brilliant session. We have a bit of a break on the economy stage now, but join us again at 2 p.m. where we'll be hearing from Mackenzie and the Digital Catapult on what research tells us about what life after the pandemic will look like. So join us at 2 p.m. for that session. And don't forget, you can tweet us via @CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 to continue the conversation. And with that, I'll see you later.